judge's vicious attack on Pam Bondi explodes into chaos. Minutes later, he's the one in cuffs. You won't believe what unravels next. Before we dive in, drop a comment with your city button. Where are you watching from? Smash that like button and subscribe for more jaw-dropping tales. Let's roll! The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Attorney General Pam Bondi stepped inside. She carried a thick stack of files under her arm, her face set with determination. Today's case was no small matter. It involved a prominent city official accused of rigging a major election to secure his position. The evidence was airtight, and Pam had spent months building it piece by piece. She was ready to present it before Judge Victor Ramsey, a man known for his biting sarcasm and iron grip on his courtroom. Pam had faced tough judges before, but something about Victor made her pause. His reputation wasn't just about being strict. People whispered he had his own way of bending the rules. She approached the prosecution table and set her files down. The room grew quiet as Victor entered, his black robe swishing against the floor. He climbed the steps to his bench and sat, adjusting his glasses. Without a word, he picked up a pen and tapped it against his desk, the sound sharp in the stillness. Pam straightened her jacket, waiting for the hearing to begin. The defendant, Councilman Edwin Pierce, sat across the room with his lawyer, both looking calm and collected. Too calm, Pam thought. Victor finally looked up, his gaze landing on Pam. His lips twitched into a thin smile. "Well, Attorney General Bondi," he said, his voice dripping with mockery, "I see you've decided to grace us with your presence. I hope you've brought something worth hearing, or are we all just here to watch you shuffle papers for an hour?" A few people in the gallery stifled laughs. Edwin's lawyer smirked, leaning back in his chair. Pam kept her expression steady. She'd dealt with jabs like this before. "Your Honor," she replied, her tone firm, "I'm here to present evidence of election fraud that threatens the integrity of this city. I think the court will find it more than worth the time." She reached for her first file, ready to lay out the case. Victor raised a hand, stopping her. "Oh, I'm sure you think it's important, Bondi, but let's not pretend this isn't another one of your overblown crusades. Election fraud sounds like a fancy way to say you don't like losing." His words cut through the room, sharp and deliberate. The gallery shifted, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging uneasy glances. Pam's fingers tightened around the file. She forced a calm breath. "Your Honor, the evidence will show clear tampering with voter records. This isn't about opinions, it's about facts." She opened the folder and pulled out a printed spreadsheet, holding it up for the court to see. Victor leaned forward, squinting at the paper. Then he chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. "What's this? A grocery list? You expect me to take that seriously?" He waved a hand as if brushing her off. "Sit down, Bondi. You're embarrassing yourself already." The room tensed. Pam stood her ground, her voice steady. "This is a log of altered voter registrations, Your Honor. It's the first piece of evidence. And I have more." She placed the spreadsheet on the table and met his stare. Victor's smile faded, replaced by a hard, unreadable look. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he sat back, folding his arms. "Go on then," he said, his tone icy. "But don't expect me to hold your hand through this nonsense." Pam nodded once and began her opening statement, detailing how Edwin Pierce had manipulated the election to secure his seat. She kept her words clear and precise, knowing every eye in the room was on her. Victor watched, his fingers drumming on the bench, waiting for his next chance to strike. Pam stood at the prosecution table, her voice steady as she walked the courtroom through the voter registration logs. She pointed to specific entries, each one showing names added to the rolls after the deadline, all linked to addresses that didn't exist. The evidence was clear, and she made sure every word landed with weight. Judge Victor Ramsey sat behind his bench, his fingers no longer drumming. Now, he gripped a pen tightly, his knuckles pale against the dark wood. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by a stiff, watchful silence. She flicked to the next page in her stack. "Your Honor, these records were cross-checked with city property data. Over 200 of these so-called voters were registered to vacant lots owned by Councilman Edwin Pierce's development company." She held up a photograph of an empty field, the grass overgrown and untouched. This isn't a mistake, it's a pattern. The gallery stirred, a low hum of voices rising as people leaned forward in their seats. Victor cleared his throat, cutting through the noise. "Bondi," he said, his voice sharp enough to slice glass. "You're throwing around accusations like confetti. Do you have anything real, or are you just hoping to bore us into believing you?" He leaned forward, his glasses catching the light. "I've seen better evidence in a traffic ticket." The jab stung, but Pam didn't waver. She set the photo down and picked up a thick report. "This is real, Your Honor. It's a forensic analysis of the election database. It shows unauthorized access from an IP address traced to the councilman's office." She turned to face Edwin Pierce, who sat rigid beside his lawyer, his tie slightly crooked. The timestamps matched nights when his staff claimed he was working late. Edwin's lawyer, a wiry man named Leonard Hayes, shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is speculation. There's no proof my client was personally involved." His voice was smooth, practiced, but a bead of sweat glistened on his forehead. Victor waved a hand lazily. "Sustained. Bondi, if you're going to point fingers, at least make sure they're clean. I'm not here to play detective for you." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "Try again." Pam pressed her lips together, keeping her frustration in check. She knew Victor was baiting her, trying to derail the case before it gained traction, but she had more. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce a sworn affidavit from a whistleblower inside the councilman's campaign." She tore the seal and slid the document onto the table. This staff member witnessed Edwin Pierce instructing his team to fabricate voter data. It's dated and notarized. The room shifted again, the hum growing louder. A woman in the gallery whispered to her neighbor, her eyes wide. Edwin's calm mask slipped for a fraction of a second, his fingers twitching against the table. Leonard leaned over to whisper something, but Edwin brushed him off, his jaw tight. Victor stared at the affidavit, his expression unreadable. Then he laughed, a short, harsh sound that echoed off the walls. "An affidavit from some disgruntled lackey looking for a payout? Bondi, you're reaching so far you might as well be in the next county." He tossed his pen onto the bench, letting it roll to the edge. "This is a courtroom, not a tabloid press conference." Pam took a step closer to the bench, her voice rising just enough to carry. "With respect, Your Honor, this witness is willing to testify under oath. Their statement aligns with the digital evidence. You can dismiss it, but the jury won't." She gestured to the 12 men and women seated to her left, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Victor's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being challenged, especially not in his own domain. He sat up straighter, his tone turning cold. "You think you can lecture me about my jury, Bondi? I decide what they hear, not you. And right now, I'm hearing a lot of noise and not much substance." He pointed at the affidavit. "That's inadmissible until I say otherwise. Move on." The dismissal landed like a slap, but Pam didn't flinch. She'd expected resistance. Victor wasn't just protecting procedure, he was shielding something bigger. She could see it in the way his gaze flicked toward Edwin, just for a moment, before returning to her. There was a connection here, one he didn't want exposed. She filed that thought away and picked up her next piece of evidence, a stack of printed emails. "Your Honor," she said, keeping her tone even, "these are communications between Councilman Pierce and a known data broker, Marcus Teller, who specializes in digital manipulation. They discuss payment for voter list enhancements 2 weeks before the election." She handed copies to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge and the defense. The amounts match withdrawals from a campaign fund that Edwin personally oversaw. Victor skimmed the pages, his lips pressing into a thin line. He didn't interrupt this time, but his silence felt heavier than his words. Edwin shifted in his seat, his hands folding and unfolding. Leonard scribbled notes furiously, his earlier confidence fading. The gallery was fully alert now, every word drawing them deeper into the unfolding drama. Pam pressed forward, sensing the shift. "The broker has already been questioned by my office. He's prepared to confirm these emails in exchange for leniency. This isn't a theory, Your Honor. It's a trail leading straight to the defendant." She paused, letting the statement settle, then added, "And I have reason to believe this trail doesn't end with him." Victor's head snapped up at that, his eyes locking onto hers. "What's that supposed to mean, Bondi?" His voice was low, almost a growl. "You're in my courtroom. If you've got something to say, spit it out." Pam met his stare without hesitation. "It means, Your Honor, that this case involves more than one person, and I intend to find out who else had a hand in it." She didn't look away, didn't soften her words. The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Victor's face hardened, a flush creeping up his neck. He opened his mouth to respond, but Pam wasn't finished. She turned to the projector and clicked it on, displaying a bank statement. This account received a deposit of $50,000 the day after the election results were certified. It's registered to a shell company tied to the councilman's brother, but the transfer came from an offshore account we're still tracing. She faced Victor again. "I'm requesting a continuance to investigate further. This isn't just about Edwin Pierce anymore." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, louder than before. A man in the back row stood, phone in hand, already typing. Edwin's lawyer jumped up again. "Objection! This is irrelevant and prejudicial." Leonard's voice cracked slightly, betraying his nerves. Victor slammed his gavel once, the sound sharp and final. "Enough!" He glared at Pam, his composure fraying. "You're turning this into a circus, Bondi. I ought to hold you in contempt for wasting everyone's time with this fishing expedition." He pointed the gavel at her. "You're done for now. Sit down." Pam didn't sit. She stood taller, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, if you refuse to let this evidence in, I'll have to ask why. The public deserves to know what's happening here." It was a bold move, a direct challenge. The gallery went silent, every breath held. Victor's face turned red, his hand trembling as he gripped the gavel. "You don't question me in my courtroom, Bondi. You think you're untouchable because you're the Attorney General. I'll show you what happens when you push too far." He banged the gavel again, harder this time. "Recess. 15 minutes. Get your act together, or I'll end this hearing myself." He stormed off the bench, robe billowing as he disappeared through the side door. Pam watched him go, her mind racing. That wasn't just anger, it was fear. She glanced at Edwin, who avoided her gaze, his hands clenched into fists. Something was unraveling, and she was about to pull the thread that would bring it all down. The courtroom doors swung shut behind Judge Victor Ramsey as he vanished into his chambers, leaving a charged silence in his wake. Pam Bondi stood at the prosecution table, her eyes fixed on the spot where he'd been. The recess he'd called wasn't a break. It was a retreat. She could feel it. Victor's outburst had cracked his carefully built armor, and she wasn't about to let that opening slip away. The gallery buzzed with hushed voices, spectators piecing together what they'd just seen. Edwin Pierce sat stiffly across the room, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear, but the councilman's face betrayed him. His eyes darted toward the exit, then back to the empty bench. Pam turned to her team, a small group of sharp-eyed attorneys huddled behind her. "Get me everything we have on that offshore account," she said quietly, her voice steady but urgent. "I want names, dates, anything that ties it closer." One of her assistants, a young woman named Clara, nodded and slipped out of the room with a tablet in hand. Pam knew the bank statement she'd shown was just the tip of something much larger. Victor's reaction told her he wasn't just annoyed, he was cornered. The bailiff called out, "Court resumes in 12 minutes, and the room settled into an uneasy hum. Pam sat briefly, flipping through her notes, her mind working fast. She'd come prepared for Edwin's defense, but Victor's hostility was a curve she hadn't fully anticipated. His jabs weren't random, they were calculated, like a wall he was trying to build around the case. She glanced at the jury, catching a man in a grey sweater scribbling something on a notepad. They were paying attention, and that was her leverage. The side door creaked open, and Victor returned, his face composed but his steps heavier than before. He climbed back to his bench and banged the gavel once, the sound cutting through the chatter. "Order!" he barked. "We're back. Bondi, I hope you've used the break to rethink your strategy, because I'm not in the mood for more of your wild guesses." His tone was sharp, but his eyes avoided hers, focusing instead on the papers in front of him. Pam stood, smoothing her jacket. "Your Honor, I'm ready to proceed with evidence that's anything but a guess." She reached for a new folder, this one marked with a red tab. "I have phone records showing calls between Councilman Pierce and a private consultant, Marcus Teller, who specializes in digital manipulation. These calls happened the same nights the election database was accessed. She handed the records to the bailiff, who passed them up to Victor. The judge barely glanced at them before tossing them aside. Phone calls? That's your big reveal. People talk on the phone every day, Bondi. You're grasping at straws. He folded his arms, leaning back with a forced calm that didn't match the tension in his shoulders. Pam didn't pause. She pulled out a second sheet. These aren't just calls, Your Honor. They're followed by text messages. One reads, "Make sure the numbers look clean by tomorrow." It's sent from Edwin's personal number to Teller's burner phone. She turned to the projector and clicked it on, displaying the message in bold black letters. The gallery gasped, a ripple of shock spreading through the rows. Edwin's lawyer, Leonard Hayes, leapt up. "Objection! Chain of custody hasn't been established for that device." His voice was louder now, almost desperate. Edwin shifted beside him, his fingers tapping rapidly against the table. Victor raised a hand. "Sustained. Bondi, you can't just wave around texts and expect me to buy it. Where's the proof this even came from Pierce?" His words were clipped, his gaze flicking toward Edwin for a split second. Pam anticipated that. She slid a third document across the table. "This is a warrant we executed last night. It confirms the burner phone was found in Teller's possession, and he's identified Edwin as the sender. He is in custody now, ready to testify." She let that land, watching Victor's reaction. His jaw tightened, and his hand froze mid-motion as he reached for his water glass. The courtroom tilted into chaos. Voices rose from the gallery, a mix of disbelief and excitement. A woman in a blue coat pulled out her phone, typing furiously. Edwin's face drained of color, his hands dropping to his lap. Leonard whispered something again, but Edwin shook his head sharply, his composure crumbling. Victor banged his gavel twice, the sound harsh. "Quiet!" he shouted. "Bondi, you're turning this into a free-for-all. I won't have it." Pam stepped forward, undeterred. "Your Honor, this is a courtroom, not a shield. The evidence is stacking up, and you can't keep brushing it aside." Her voice was firm, cutting through the noise. "I'm requesting a sidebar to discuss your refusal to admit these records. It's starting to look like bias." The word hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Victor's eyes widened, then narrowed into slits. "Bias?" he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "You're accusing me of bias in my own court?" He stood, towering over the bench, his robe swaying slightly. "You've got some nerve, Bondi. I should hold you in contempt right now." Pam didn't back down. "If you do, Your Honor, you'll have to explain it to the State Review Board. Because I'm not the only one who sees what's happening here." She gestured subtly to the jury, then to the gallery, where every face was locked on the exchange. "This isn't about me. It's about the truth." Victor's face flushed a deep red, his breath coming faster. He pointed a finger at her. "You don't get to threaten me, Bondi. I run this room, not you." He sat back down hard, the chair creaking under his weight. "Your request for a sidebar is denied. And those texts? Inadmissible. I'm done with this nonsense." The gallery erupted again, louder this time. A man in the back called out, "What's he hiding?" before the bailiff shushed him. Edwin's lawyer stood frozen, his objection forgotten. Pam stayed calm, her mind racing ahead. Victor wasn't just dismissing evidence, he was burying it. And she knew why. The offshore account, the sudden deposit, the way he flinched when she mentioned a broader investigation. It wasn't just Edwin in the crosshairs. Victor was part of this. She reached into her briefcase again, this time pulling out a small USB drive. "Your Honor," she said, her voice rising above the chaos, "I have one more piece of evidence. It's an audio file, legally obtained through a wiretap on Marcus Teller's line." She held up the drive, her hand steady. "It's short, but I think the court needs to hear it." Victor's hand slammed down on the bench before she could finish. "No, you're not playing anything in here, Bondi. This is my courtroom, and I say what goes." His voice cracked, betraying a panic he couldn't hide. The room went still, every eye on him. Even Edwin looked startled, his head snapping toward the judge. Pam lowered the drive, but didn't sit. "Your Honor, you can stop me now, but this won't stay quiet. If you won't let the jury hear it, I'll make sure it's heard elsewhere." It wasn't a bluff. She'd already sent copies to her office, and the press was watching. Victor knew it too. His chest heaved, his stare locked on her. Then, in a move that stunned everyone, he stood again and pointed at the bailiff. "Take her into custody. She's disrupting this hearing." Gasps filled the room. The bailiff hesitated, glancing between Pam and Victor. "Now!" Victor roared, his face a mask of fury. Pam didn't move. She set the USB drive on the table and folded her arms. "You're making a mistake, Your Honor, and it's going to cost you." The bailiff approached, uncertain, but before he could reach her, Pam turned to the back of the room and nodded once, sharp and deliberate. The rear doors burst open. 2 state marshals in crisp uniforms marched in, their boots loud against the floor. "Judge Victor Ramsey," one announced, his voice booming. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and suspected conspiracy in election fraud." The room exploded into noise, chairs scraping, voices shouting. Victor froze, his hand still outstretched, his mouth open in disbelief. Pam stepped back as the marshals advanced. Victor's gavel slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the bench. "This is outrageous," he sputtered. But the fight was draining from him. The marshals flanked him, one pulling out handcuffs. The click of metal echoed as they locked around his wrists, a sound that silenced the chaos for a single, breathtaking moment. Edwin Pierce slumped in his chair, his lawyer staring blankly ahead. The gallery was a frenzy, phones out, cameras flashing. Pam remained still, her face calm but her pulse racing. He'd planned for this, but seeing it unfold was something else. Victor glared at her as the marshals led him down from the bench, his voice a weak rasp. "You'll regret this, Bondi." She met his gaze, unflinching. "No, Your Honor, you will." And with that, he was gone, escorted out through the side door he'd fled to minutes earlier. The courtroom spun with energy, but Pam's focus shifted to Edwin. He was next, and she wasn't done yet. The courtroom doors thudded shut as the marshals hauled Judge Victor Ramsey away, his muffled protests fading down the hall. A stunned silence settled over the room, broken only by the rapid tapping of fingers on phone screens as spectators sent the news racing beyond the walls. Pam Bondi stood at the prosecution table, her posture steady, but her mind was already leaping ahead. Victor's arrest was a victory, but it was only the first domino. Councilman Edwin Pierce still sat across from her, his face pale, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles gleamed white. The real battle was just beginning. The bailiff, a stocky man named Henry, stepped forward, his voice uncertain. Court is adjourned until a replacement judge is assigned." He glanced at Pam, then at the empty bench, clearly unsure what to do next. The jury shifted in their seats, whispering among themselves, while Leonard Hayes, Edwin's lawyer, slumped back in his chair, his notes scattered across the table. The gallery was a storm of activity. People standing, some rushing for the exits to beat the crowd. Pam didn't sit. She turned to Edwin, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Councilman Pierce, I suggest you start thinking about your options. Your judge isn't here to protect you anymore." Her words were calm, deliberate, each one landing like a stone in still water. Edwin's head jerked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since Victor's outburst. Fear flickered there, raw and unmasked. Leonard recovered enough to stand. "Don't say a word, Edwin," he snapped, his tone sharp but shaky. "This is harassment. We'll file a motion to dismiss everything after that stunt." He pointed at Pam, his finger trembling slightly. "You've turned this into a spectacle, Bondi." Pam tilted her head, unfazed. "A spectacle? No, Mr. Hayes, this is what happens when the law catches up, and it's about to catch up with your client." She reached for her briefcase and pulled out a slim laptop, setting it on the table. "I wasn't finished presenting evidence before the recess. I think now's a good time to pick up where we left off." The room quieted, curiosity pulling people back to their seats. Even the bailiff paused, watching her. Edwin's breathing grew shallow, his tie now visibly askew. Pam opened the laptop and plugged in the USB drive she'd tried to introduce earlier. "This audio file," she said, her voice clear and firm, "was recorded 3 days before the election. It's Marcus Teller, the consultant, speaking to someone on a secure line." She pressed play, and a low, gravelly voice filled the courtroom. "Everything's set," the voice said, clipped and urgent. The lists are clean and the extras are in place. Just keep her off my back, all right? Bondi's digging too close. A pause. Then a second voice. Deeper, familiar. Don't worry. I'll handle it. She won't get past me. The recording ended with a faint click, leaving the air thick with tension. The gallery erupted into gasps and hurried whispers. A woman in a red scarf stood, clutching her purse, her mouth open. Edwin's lawyer froze mid-step, his objection dying in his throat. Pam let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. The second voice belongs to Judge Victor Ramsey. We confirmed it with voice analysis this morning. She closed the laptop and faced the room. This isn't just about election fraud anymore. It's about a conspiracy to bury the truth. Edwin shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a setup," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You doctored that. You're trying to ruin me." His face was flushed, sweat beading on his forehead. Leonard grabbed his arm, pulling him back down, but the damage was done. The jury stared, their notebooks forgotten, every one of them locked on the councilman's outburst. Pam kept her tone even. "The evidence speaks for itself, Mr. Pierce, and there's more." She reached into her briefcase again, this time pulling out a thick packet of bank records. "These show payments from that offshore account I mentioned earlier, 50,000 to Victor Ramsey's personal account, wired the day after the election, and another 20,000 to a consulting firm owned by Marcus Teller." She handed the packet to Henry, who hesitated before taking it. "I'm submitting this for the record. Whenever court resumes." The room tilted into pandemonium. A man in a grey suit bolted for the door, shouting into his phone, "Get this on the wire now." The jury exchanged wide-eyed looks, one woman covering her mouth. Edwin sank back into his seat, his hands shaking. Leonard stood again, his voice rising. "This is inadmissible without a judge present. You can't just—" Pam cut him off. "It's admissible once the new judge reviews it, Mr. Hayes, and they will. Because I'm not stopping here." She turned to the gallery, raising her voice slightly. "This case isn't just about one election. It's about a network of people who thought they could buy their way out of accountability. They were wrong." The doors at the back swung open again, and Clara, Pam's assistant, hurried in, a tablet clutched to her chest. She leaned close, whispering, "We traced the offshore account. It's linked to a holding company owned by Edwin's sister-in-law, and there's another payment pending, to a city clerk who oversees voter rolls." Pam's eyes sharpened. She nodded once, then faced the room again. "Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice carrying a new edge, "your sister-in-law's company seems to have a lot of cash floating around. Care to explain?" Edwin didn't answer. He stared at the table, his breathing ragged. Leonard tried to speak, but Pam pressed on. "Or maybe you'd rather tell us about the city clerk who's been altering records for you. We've got her in custody too. She's talking." The gallery was a whirlwind now, people crowding the aisles, voices overlapping. Henry shouted for order, but it was useless. Edwin's head dropped into his hands, his lawyer slumping beside him. Pam stepped around the table, her presence commanding the room. "This isn't over," she said, addressing everyone. "Victor Ramsey was only part of the problem. If my team could uncover this, it means there's more. More names, more people who thought they were untouchable." A new figure entered through the side door, a woman in a crisp suit, her hair pulled back tightly. She carried a stack of folders and moved with purpose. "Attorney General Bondi," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "I'm Judge Laura Kent. I've been assigned to take over this case, effective immediately." The room stilled, all eyes shifting to her. She climbed the steps to the bench and sat, adjusting her glasses. "I've reviewed the filings from the past hour. We're proceeding." Now Pam nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face. "Thank you, Your Honor." She turned back to Edwin, who looked up at last, his expression a mix of dread and resignation. "Let's start with the audio file," Pam said, plugging the USB drive into the courtroom system, "and then we'll move to the bank records. We've got a long day ahead." Judge Kent banged her gavel once, sharp and firm. "Order." "Miss Bondi, you have the floor." The gallery settled, every seat filled, every ear tuned to what came next. Edwin's empire was crumbling, and Pam was about to bring the rest of it down, brick by brick. Judge Laura Kent's gavel strike echoed through the courtroom, silencing the last of the gallery's murmurs. Pam Bondi stood at the prosecution table, the USB drive now connected to the courtroom's audio system. She pressed play, and Marcus Teller's gravelly voice filled the space once more, his words sharp and incriminating. "Everything's set, the lists are clean, and the extras are in place. Just keep her off my back, all right?" Bondi's digging too close. Then Victor Ramsey's deeper tone followed. "Don't worry, I'll handle it. She won't get past me." The recording cut off, leaving a heavy stillness in its wake. The jury sat upright, their faces a mix of shock and focus. Edwin Pierce slumped further in his chair, his tie now a wrinkled mess around his neck. His lawyer, Leonard Hayes, gripped the table's edge, his earlier protests replaced by a strained silence. Judge Kent adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable as she jotted something on a notepad. "Miss Bondi," she said, her voice steady, "proceed with your explanation of this evidence." Pam nodded, stepping forward. "Your Honor, this recording proves Judge Ramsey conspired with Marcus Teller to obstruct my investigation into the election fraud orchestrated by Councilman Pierce." She gestured to the bank records still in Henry's hands. "Those documents I submitted earlier show payments from an offshore account to both Ramsey and Teller, timed perfectly with the election's certification. It's a clear trail of corruption." The gallery stirred, a low buzz rising as people processed the weight of her words. Judge Kent raised a hand, quieting them. "I've reviewed the records during the transition. They're admissible. Continue, Ms. Bondi." Her tone was firm, a stark shift from Victor's dismissive snarls, and it sent a ripple of anticipation through the room. Pam picked up the packet of bank statements and handed a copy to the jury foreman. "These transactions don't just implicate Ramsey and Teller. They tie back to a holding company owned by Edwin Pierce's sister-in-law, Carla Hensley. She funneled money through shell accounts to cover up the fraud." She turned to Edwin, her voice cutting through the air. "Councilman, your family seems deeply invested in keeping you in power. Why is that?" Edwin's head snapped up, his eyes wild. "That's a lie!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Carla has nothing to do with this. You're dragging innocent people into your vendetta." He slammed a fist on the table, the sound jarring. Leonard grabbed his shoulder, hissing, "Sit down, Edwin. You're making it worse." Judge Kent banged her gavel twice. "Order. Mr. Pierce, you'll have your turn. Ms. Bondi, do you have evidence linking Ms. Hensley directly?" Her question was sharp, testing Pam's case. Pam reached into her briefcase and pulled out a new stack of papers. "Yes, Your Honor. These are emails between Carla Hensley and a bank manager in the Cayman Islands arranging the transfers. They're time-stamped 2 days before the election." She handed them to Henry, who passed them to the judge. "And we have a witness. The city clerk, Diane Voss, confessed this morning. She altered voter rolls under orders from Edwin, with Carla coordinating the payments." The courtroom tilted into uproar. A man in a green jacket stood, shouting, "This is bigger than we thought," before Henry waved him down. The jury scribbled notes, their pens moving fast. Edwin's face drained of color, his hands trembling as he stared at the table. Leonard stood, his voice rising. "Objection, Your Honor. We haven't seen this witness or these emails. This is ambush litigation." Judge Kent peered over her glasses. "Overruled, Mr. Hayes. The prosecution disclosed Ms. Voss's statement in their latest filing, which I've reviewed. As for the emails, they're now in evidence. Sit down." Leonard sank back, his argument crushed under her authority. Pam pressed forward, sensing the momentum. "Your Honor, Diane Voss isn't just a witness. She's a key piece. She's given us a list of 6 other officials who took bribes to look the other way during the election. 2 are sitting council members." She pulled out a handwritten list, the ink smudged but legible, and held it up. "This isn't one man's crime. It's a machine. And Edwin Pierce was running it." The gallery exploded again, voices overlapping in a chaotic wave. A woman in a yellow blouse clutched her phone, recording the scene. Edwin leapt up, his chair tipping over with a crash. "You're ruining everything," he yelled, pointing at Pam. "This is all fabricated. I'll sue you for defamation." His outburst drew gasps, the jury leaning forward, captivated. Judge Kent slammed her gavel 3 times, the sound like gunfire. "Mr. Pierce, control yourself, or I'll have you removed." She turned to Pam. Miss Bondi, submit that list. I want it verified. Pam handed it to Henry, who passed it up. Kent scanned it, her lips tightening. This is serious. I'm ordering an immediate investigation into these names. Edwin sank back into his seat, his outburst spent. Leonard whispered furiously, but Edwin waved him off, his eyes hollow. Pam wasn't done. She turned to the projector and clicked on a new image, a grainy photo of a man in a dark coat handing an envelope to another figure outside a warehouse. This was taken last week, she said. The man on the left is Marcus Teller. The other is a courier who delivered cash to Diane Voss. We've tracked the envelope to Carla Hensley's office. The room gasped again, the photo sealing the connection. Judge Kent leaned forward, studying the screen. Miss Bondi, you're building a web here. Where does it end? Her question was pointed, urging Pam to tie it together. Pam faced her squarely. It ends when every person in this scheme faces justice, Your Honor. Edwin Pierce didn't act alone. Victor Ramsey didn't either. Carla Hensley funded it, Diane Voss executed it, and there are more names on that list who profited. She turned to Edwin, her voice unwavering. Councilman, you can keep denying it, but the walls are closing in. Tell us who else was involved, or we'll find out ourselves. Edwin didn't respond. He stared at the photo, his hands limp in his lap. Leonard stood again, weaker this time. Your Honor, my client needs time to review this new evidence. We request a recess. His plea sounded hollow, a last gasp. Judge Kent shook her head. Denied. We're finishing this today. Miss Bondi, do you have more? Her eyes locked on Pam, expectant. Pam nodded, reaching for her laptop again. Yes, Your Honor. I have a video deposition from Diane Voss, recorded 2 hours ago. She connected the device to the projector and hit play. Diane's face appeared, tired but resolute, her voice trembling slightly. Edwin told me to add the names. He said it was the only way to win. Carla handled the money, and Judge Ramsey promised to block any investigation. The clip ended, and the courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Edwin's head dropped into his hands, a low groan escaping him. The jury stared, unblinking. The gallery was a mix of shock and outrage. A man in a plaid shirt muttering, "Emily rigged it all." Judge Kent sat back, her face grim. Miss Bondi, I'm admitting this deposition. Mr. Hayes, your client has 5 minutes to decide if he's cooperating or we proceed with charges now. Pam stepped back, her work laid bare. Edwin's empire was in ruins, and the conspiracy was unraveling faster than anyone expected. The room pulsed with energy, every eye on the councilman as the clock ticked down. He lifted his head, his voice barely audible. I want a deal. The words cracked the silence, and Pam knew the real reckoning was just beginning. Judge Laura Kent's eyes narrowed as Edwin Pierce's whispered plea for a deal hung in the air. The courtroom held its breath, the weight of his surrender pressing down on every corner. Pam Bondi stood at the prosecution table, her laptop still glowing with Diane Voss's damning video deposition. The jury watched intently, their pencils poised over notepads, while the gallery buzzed with a restless energy, phones discreetly recording the moment. Leonard Hayes, Edwin's lawyer, sat frozen, his face a mask of defeat. 5 minutes, Judge Kent had said, and the clock was ticking. Pam spoke first, her voice steady and clear. Your Honor, if Mr. Pierce wants a deal, he needs to give us everything. Names, dates, every step of this operation. She turned to Edwin, her gaze piercing. You've got a lot to answer for, Councilman. Your sister-in-law, the clerk, the judge, they're all talking. You're the last piece. Start now or the offer's off the table. Edwin lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling as he clasped them together. You don't understand, he muttered, his voice raw. This wasn't just me. It goes higher. He glanced at Leonard, who shook his head furiously, but Edwin ignored him. I'll talk, but I want protection. They'll come for me. The gallery erupted, voices rising in a chaotic swell. A woman in a grey coat shouted, Who's they? Before Henry, the bailiff, barked for quiet. Judge Kent leaned forward, her gavel raised but unused. Mr. Pierce, she said, her tone firm. Clarify that statement. Who are you afraid of? Edwin swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping. The mayor's office. They pushed me to do it. Said we couldn't lose the council seat or the whole budget would fall apart. He ran a hand through his hair, his words tumbling out faster. Carla got the money from a developer, big guy named Randall Klein. He's got projects all over the city. Ramsey was supposed to kill the case if it got too close. They all knew. The room exploded again, louder than before. A man in a brown vest stood yelling, "The mayor!" as others scrambled to their feet. Judge Kent banged her gavel 3 times, the sound cutting through the noise. "Silence," she commanded. "Mr. Pierce, you're implicating elected officials and private citizens. Do you have proof?" Pam stepped in, sensing the opening. "Your Honor, we do." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope, tearing it open with precision. "These are financial records from Randall Klein's company, obtained through a subpoena this morning. They show transfers to Carla Hensley's holding company, matching the dates Edwin just mentioned." She handed the papers to Henry, who passed them to the judge. "And we have Klein's assistant in custody. She's confirmed he met with the mayor's chief of staff last month." Judge Kent skimmed the documents, her lips tightening. "This is explosive, Miss Bondi. You're alleging corruption at the highest levels of city government." She set the papers down and looked at Edwin. "Councilman, if you're serious about cooperating, you'll need to testify. On the record, today." Edwin nodded weakly, his fight gone. "I'll do it. Just keep them away from me." Leonard slumped back, burying his face in his hands, his defense in tatters. The jury exchanged stunned glances, their role suddenly bigger than they'd imagined. The gallery was a frenzy, people crowding the aisles, some pushing toward the doors to spread the news. Pam wasn't done. She turned to the projector and loaded a new file, a grainy security video. "This is footage from a parking garage near City Hall, dated 2 weeks before the election," she said, clicking play. The screen showed Randall Klein, a tall man in a tailored suit, handing a briefcase to a woman in a hooded jacket. The woman turned briefly, revealing Carla Hensley's profile. "That's the money drop Edwin just described. We've traced the serial numbers on the cash to Klein's personal safe." The courtroom gasped, the image burning into everyone's minds. Judge Kent sat back, her face grim. "Ms. Bondi, this changes everything. I'm issuing an emergency order to detain Randall Klein and Carla Hensley for questioning." She turned to Henry. "Contact the marshals, now." Henry nodded and hurried to the phone near the bench. Edwin stared at the floor, his breathing shallow. Pam pressed forward, her voice rising with purpose. "Your Honor, there's one more piece. The mayor's chief of staff, Gregory Tate, sent this email to Edwin 3 days ago." She clicked the projector again, displaying a message. "Shut it down, or we're all finished. It's encrypted, but our tech team cracked it this afternoon." The gallery lost control, a roar of voices filling the space. A man in a blue cap shouted, "They're all in on it," as others surged forward. Judge Kent slammed her gavel repeatedly. "Order! I will clear this room if I have to." She turned to Pam. "Mr. Bondyke, submit that email. I'm fast-tracking a warrant for Mr. Tate's arrest." Pam handed the printed email to Henry, who rushed it to the judge. Edwin broke, his voice a whisper. "Tate told me to push the clerk, said the mayor needed the numbers to stay clean. I didn't want to, but they had me cornered." He looked up, tears streaking his face. "I'm done. I'll tell you everything." Judge Kent nodded, her decision swift. "Mr. Pierce, you're remanded into protective custody, pending your full statement. Marshals will take you now." She glanced at Pam. "Ms. Bondi, your team has 48 hours to file charges against all named parties. This court will reconvene then." The side door opened, and 2 marshals entered, their faces stern. They approached Edwin, who stood shakily, his hands outstretched. The cuffs clicked shut, a sharp sound that punctuated his fall. Leonard didn't move, his head still in his hands, as the marshals led Edwin out. The gallery watched in stunned silence, the reality sinking in. Pam gathered her files, her focus unbroken. "Your Honor," she said, "we're not stopping here. This goes beyond the city. Klein's company has state contracts. We're digging deeper." She turned to the jury, her voice carrying a quiet power. "You've seen the truth today. It's up to you to decide what it means. Judge Kent banged her gavel once more. Court is adjourned. The room erupted as she stepped down, reporters flooding the aisles, their cameras flashing. Pam stayed at her table, watching Edwin disappear through the door. Clara, her assistant, approached, tablet in hand. We've got Klein's assistant on the line. She's naming more names. Pam nodded, a faint smile breaking through. Good. Let's bring them all down. The courtroom emptied, but the energy lingered, a city on the brink of upheaval. Edwin's confession had cracked the foundation, and Pam was ready to tear the rest apart. Outside, sirens wailed as marshals fanned out, the hunt for Klein, Hensley and Tate already underway. This wasn't just a trial anymore, it was a revolution, and Pam Bondi had lit the fuse.